Welcome, Kiara, to the Thank Goddess podcast. I'm so excited to have you here and talking about what I believe is a very interesting topic. I mean, who doesn't love speaking on the topic of relationships, particularly as women, which most of my listeners are? So I'm very, very excited to have you here and to be talking about this and getting your expert opinion on. We're going to be focusing on sacred union or sacred relationship, conscious relationship, whatever terminology you want to use. So I think this is going to be a really juicy and interesting conversation. So welcome, welcome. I think before we get into today's conversation, I'd love to learn a little bit about you and your background. And I suppose, what was it that intrigued you and so much about relationships that made you pursue this as a career and write your book? So I'm curious to know how that all unfolded.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be able to speak to you on this topic today, my favorite topic to talk about, relationships. Yeah, so where I started was I found myself quite young in an abusive relationship and pretty much blocked it out and didn't want to know about it for like 10 years of my life. And then always had this dream in my heart, in my soul. I have parents who are like high school sweetheart parents, right? So I've always kind of seen healthy, happy relationships and been like, oh, I just really want that for myself. And then finding an abusive relationship, like straight up, like first thing, I was just like, oh my God, how did I end up in this? Like, it was just such a culture shock for me, I guess, at the time. And I really had to build myself back up again to get back into the dating world after that experience. Because it happened quite young, it was very formative for me. And essentially, what I found when I was finally ready to put myself back out there again is that I would just keep attracting the same kind of people to me, these kind of not really great people who really wanted to use me and kind of not really treat me very well and kind of had their own agendas underneath, the smiley happy date or whatever. And I kept attracting them. So I'd gotten past the point of like, I knew that I didn't want to date another person who potentially could be abusive again. And so I'd learned all the warning signs. I'd kind of schooled up myself on that knowledge and made sure I was really aware of it so I could really pick it up if it was to happen again. Um, and so I didn't end up dating anyone again, but I just found I would kind of say, no, I'm not interested. And then it would just keep happening every time I would go out. I had a spate of like a month where I'd be like, all right, I'm ready, universe, like send me the right people again, open my heart back up. And I just found that, yeah, wherever I would go, I would talk to the one person I didn't know at a high school party and like be like, hey, how's it going? And meet them. And they would say something really horrific to me, and I'd be like, oh, okay, I'm gonna go hide in the bathroom for a little bit. Or I'd go out clubbing and there'd be someone who's like pushing my boundaries and trying to touch me in places I wasn't really comfortable with. And yeah, there was just a spat of them. And I was like, what is happening here? And I really had to, and I'm a self-reflector. I love analyzing, I love looking into things. I was like, what is happening here that I keep attracting this kind of person to me? And I couldn't quite work it out. And what I realized was that my past trauma of my original abusive relationship, because I'd buried it, because I'd never really worked through it, the universe essentially was sending me people to try and help me to work through that trauma again, right? So the fear was in my field, and I kind of had this fear of men, and I was a bit uncertain and a bit scared. And I feel like I just kept attracting people to me to help me work with that fear and help me clear that fear. Um, and honestly, I was like, I don't know what's wrong with me. And I was like going through all the motions. And that's essentially where my love of relationships has really started, because I was able to work through that and I was able to clear that in myself so that I stopped attracting those kind of people to me. And I realized that there was a lot more to it in my field. Like, I didn't have any boundaries. I had very low self-worth. I had a lot of things that I think people who are potentially abusive would be looking for in a partner so that they could, weave their manipulation and actually get it across a lot easier and kind of get me under their spell. I had these lovebird parents. So I had this fantasy aspect to my relationships that I just thought like the first boy I was going to meet was going to be my soulmate. And like, there was just a lot of naivety in that I really had to work through to be able to finally step out into the dating world and actually attract some people who are more where I was at with how I wanted to relate and how a healthy relationship looks like to me. But I had to learn all of that. And so essentially my business is like this is what I've learned. This is how I've cleared it in myself. And I'd love to be able to teach that to other people, because you do see people in these cycles of relationships where, they meet someone, it doesn't go well. There's some sort of wound there, whether it's abusive, whether it's cheating, whether it's, abandonment, or like they just can't get someone to actually commit to them or something like that. And you see the cycle repeating often, where they might leave that one person, but they'll date someone else who's very similar in their qualities, very similar in the way they treat them. And it just kind of continues, even though they might have left or even though they might have met someone else. And I guess, yeah, that's what's really drawn me to this field, is I want to be able to help people get past the karmic cycle and actually into a healthy, happy relationship so they can enjoy their relationships.
Mm. Oh, there's so much there to unpack. I mean, even I can totally relate to everything you're just saying. I have seen loops in my dating, and even years apart, like boyfriends that I had in my late teens and then boyfriends I had in my late 20s, similar themes. And I can totally relate to what you're saying with that unhealed wound and the universe sending you someone to finally liberate yourself from that. So I'm curious then. So you spoke about this idea of karmic relationships, and I suppose that's where a lot of people are on the planet right now, in these karmic relationships. And I suppose, what's the difference between that and a sacred relationship? What makes it sacred? What makes it different from that karmic loop?
Yeah, great question. And a very tricky one to answer in some aspects, but I will give it my best shot. So I think with karmic relationships, we find ourselves stuck in those cycles, stuck in these patterns, stuck in this wounding of, maybe like, am I still stuck in an abusive cycle where my ex treated me terribly and now this person is like trying to manipulate me in a certain way? And we don't seem to get past that. I find that's the difference. Um, Oftentimes we get kind of stuck in that loop, or we respond in a certain way. So maybe our wounding is that we back down and we kind of try and protect ourselves, and we go a bit quiet and maybe we shut down. And that's the kind of pattern that plays out there. And you might try and talk to your partner about that. You might try to bring it up, to clear it and to work through it. And maybe you might go to couples therapy or something like that. But it just seems that there's not much movement on that. It's not really healing and growing. You can't really have the open conversation about it, because the other person's just going to have even more of their wounds come up when you actually speak your truth and say, this isn't okay the way you've been treating me, or like, I feel disrespected, or whatever it is. When you put your feelings out on the table, like, it might not even be safe to even get to that point. But even if you could get to that point, that person's not going to respond very well, and they're going to shut you down. They're going to gaslight you. They're going to prove to you that you're the problem in whatever way they feel they can, because they're too defensive or they're too scared to kind of have that conversation. And I feel like that's the key difference between karmic relationships and more of a soulmate connection, or more of a sacred union, even, is the person on the other end of that. You've both been able to do the inner work to be able to have those conflict conversations without escalating from 0 to 10 very quickly. And I feel like conflict is a very scary thing for a lot of people. And we often will revert back into our childhood wounding. And, our parents responded to us in this way when we shared our feelings. And therefore we just shut down. And that's what how we learned to protect ourselves. Whereas in that sacred union, that person is going to be able to hold that conversation without it escalating into a screaming match, without someone leaving, or without someone bawling their eyes out at the end of that conversation. Like, that might still happen anyway, but if they do get triggered, they'll be able to come back, and you'll actually be able to hold space for each other, and you can actually work through things. And I feel like when we have conflict and it escalates really quickly, and people get very angry, or they get very upset, or they shut down, or they fawn, which is more of a people pleasing response, we're never getting to the root cause of the problem. We're never actually able to work through that conflict that comes up because we're too busy de-escalating. So if you've tried to share, I find this really disrespectful when you do that to me, and your partner just is at you aggressively, you're never going to be able to work on that disrespect, because then it's about de-escalating them and like making sure you're safe, they're not escalate, like you're trying to helping them, you're trying to help them, and it just becomes about that. It doesn't become about the root cause of the problem anymore. Whereas in a more healthier relationship, you can actually get to that stuff. So therefore you're having more of those conversations, and people say to me like, oh, I've found my soulmate now, like it should be easy, right?
Mm.
And in some aspects, yes, but in other aspects, that person's actually able to hold that space for you to have those conversations. So things are going to come up more so because they can actually get cleared now, and because that person's actually willing to have that conversation with you in a safe way. Does that make sense?
Mm. And so, do both people in the relationship, assuming that it's a relationship of two people, do both have to be in agreement that they are going to hold space and be in this sacred union together? Or can it work with one person working on themselves and the other one not being, uh, not say they're not open to it, but maybe it's they're not really doing that self work? Is that possible, or it has to be both parties?
Yeah. So in order to clear a wound, it's usually a dynamic, right? So it's normally one, we always think when we get hurt by something, oh my gosh, I was in that abusive relationship and he hurt me and I need like him to help me or heal me or work with me on this. And I totally respect that in some aspects it isn't safe for you to kind of get that other person to really talk about these things. And I feel like abuse isn't kind of another category altogether sometimes. But with everything, there is a dynamic of which what you're reacting with is also responding to how they're reacting. And I kind of see it in my brain as like, if you look at like the infinity loop, like there's
Mm-hmm.
a dynamic, it starts here and you speak your truth, and then someone gets upset, and then they get triggered, and then we're de-escalating their trigger. And it's really, it's about, you need two people to be able to work both on themselves and go, okay, I obviously got really triggered by this. Let's go and have some self-reflection about that. Let's work out what the root cause was to that. And let's maybe I need a therapist, and maybe I need to go talk to someone individually and work through this, so then I can come back to my partner and with a bit more clarity, with a bit more understanding of what's coming up in me, and talk to them through it, so that we can both come back together, and maybe the other person needs to as well. And I think when both sides are willing to look at what's going on and not just blame immediately, I think that's where we get into trouble, when we're so busy blaming and saying the other party is at fault and I've done nothing wrong, which in some cases, some people like have done less wrong, but I don't think we should be focusing on that. I think if we focus on what is my part to play in this dynamic, maybe it's when things escalate, my partner wants to avoid, but I want to chase. There's both aspects to be healed on both sides of that. So you do need an element of buy-in from both parties to be able to look at what their part was to play in the dynamic, and also what the other person's part was to play. Because if we're too busy going, you're the problem, you're at fault, you're at this, we're never going to get anywhere. We're just going to get escalated again, and it's just going to get heightened.
I can see that being such a barrier for most people because, yeah, especially when you hear these common stories like, oh, all my exes have cheated on me, right? And of course, that's a situation where, yes, you definitely could identify with as the victim in that situation. However, you have to realize at the same time that you're the common denominator in all of those situations. So there is some sort of wound there, whether it's you like learning to value yourself more so you don't attract those people that cheat, or to stand up for yourself. There's always something for you to learn, regardless of how the other person is treating you. So I really love how you brought that whole piece around. There's something that, personal accountability.
Yeah, like even though I was in that abusive relationship and it was never my fault to be
Mm.
abused, and I should have never gone through that, but there was, like I said, like aspects I realized that were drawing this into my field, which was the lack of boundaries, which was the lack of self-worth and like putting up with less than I deserved and things like that, that was my part to play in that dynamic, that I was, okay, this is my wound that I need to look within and work on healing. And then once I'd done that work, I found I was attracting higher quality people to me afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's so much of what you spoke about there around the sacred union is around how you handle conflict. So I want to kind of focus on that for a little bit. And maybe to begin with, why do we get so triggered by our partners, those intimate relationships? What is it about that relationship that really usually brings out a side of us that maybe we don't like, or maybe other people don't see?
Mm. Yeah, great question. I think often we, even in a healthy partnership, I think we attract people to us who are going to be our greatest teachers. And often it's opposites, not always, but opposites attract in some aspects where you're like, oh, wow, I'm someone who likes to rush things, especially when I get anxious. And you're someone who just goes very slowly when you're anxious. And like, that's just such a trigger for me. So I'm like, we need to get it done. We need to do all the things. And now we're clashing because of that, because we're responding differently. But maybe that person is your biggest teacher in, okay, how do we not rush things when we're anxious, and we take a step back and have a breather for a minute and work out, okay, what's the best course of action here? And maybe I'm teaching the other person not to freeze up and not to, get stuck in the overthinking of it all and the panic and the overwhelm, and to take some action. So we do attract people to us who are our greatest teachers, which can be really, really beneficial. And I think it's that conflict piece that makes it beneficial. So I wrote a book on conflict called Healthy Relating, Navigating Conflict in Relationships. And the key message, which I think a lot of people were shocked by, was that conflict can actually be really healing. Conflict can actually really help us to grow into the best version of ourselves if done well. And I don't think a lot of people are doing conflict really well. I think that's a very out there concept for a lot of people, and I understand and appreciate that. But that sacred union piece and that healthy dynamic will be able to have those discussions and hold you in those wounds and go, where's this come from? Has it come from a parental thing? Like, why? It's really interesting that you've thought that way about this. Okay, you think we need to slow down when things aren't working, and I think we need to rush, but where does that come from? And you're having those discussions and holding space for that person without judging them and saying, you're too slow, you're too whatever, da, 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 da. Just going, talk me through that. And maybe that person's like, well, when I was a kid, I tried to take action on things and my parents shut me down every single time. So we're going to attract those kind of parental wounds, inner child wounds. We're going to attract that in our relationships because it's another chance to heal and clear that. And oftentimes our parents weren't the right person for us to actually clear that with. They may have wounded us and they may have not been ever ready to look at their part to play in that dynamic. And so what happens is we grow up and we attract a relationship, and that person is the right person who might be able to be open to helping us clear and work with that. And they might be ready to look at themselves and then also help you with that. And that's why we're attracting these people to us, because they're going to help us grow into the best version of ourselves. Does that answer your question? Have I gone off topic?
No, it has. That's really interesting. And it makes a lot of sense as well. So maybe given your, knowledge on conflict, what advice can you give to people listening around how you suggest it's best to handle conflict in a relationship?
Yeah, definitely. I think conflict is inevitable. And I think we should be, although within a safe, doing this in a safe way, I think we should be leaning into conflict. So abuse is a completely different scenario because we don't want people to be hurt or harmed by leaning into conflict in that scenario. And if you need to protect yourself, I'm giving you full permission. But if it's a relationship where you're like, it doesn't escalate aggressively, maybe your partner just shuts down and leaves. That's a situation where I think we should be leaning into that conflict and actually having those really tough conversations, which is really hard to do. So I want to appreciate that. Because when we lean into conflict and when we can have these conversations, you're going to build your intimacy a lot stronger if you can do it well. So it's about having these conversations, reflecting on our own part and going, okay, obviously we've both hurt each other in this dynamic. So how can we do this better next time if it was to happen again? What do you need from me right now? And maybe if you're the avoidant partner, you're like, okay, I need like at least half an hour to just go and settle myself, because when conflict happens, we go into that fight, flight, freeze, fawn, especially if it's a big childhood wound that's going to trigger
Mm-hmm.
us more. And the less work we've done on this stuff, the more likely you are to get a very heightened reaction.
Yeah.
So that's something we need to work on within ourselves, number one. And then once we've kind of, okay, I've gone away for my 30 minutes, I've done a breathing exercise, or I've meditated, or I've journaled, or I've, you know, screamed into a pillow, whatever I needed to do to let that out and let my nervous system come back down to calm. I'm going to come back and I'm going to, at a different time, say, all right, we need to talk about this again. And try and actually get to the root cause of the problem without escalating again. Because if we can lean into that, and if we can have those conversations, like when you did this, it made me think this, that opens it up for your partner to be like, oh, I had no idea that's what you were thinking. I didn't mean to disrespect you, or I didn't mean to make you feel abandoned. I was just trying to protect myself in that moment, or I was just trying to do whatever I was trying to do with my wound. And you can go, oh, so this was a miscommunication. Like 90%, I can't throw a statistic. Most arguments are miscommunication at the end of the day, where we've taken something someone said more personally because of a wound, and it's triggered that wound, but that's not necessarily what they meant by that. And if we can have those conversations, we're going to be able to clear that. And we're also going to be able to tell our partner, like, oh, I'm really sorry you felt abandoned in that moment. That was not my intention. And how can I do that better for you next time? Okay, instead of leaving for 2 days, I'm going to only leave for 30 minutes, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to have that awkward conversation. And what would make me feel safer in that would be for you not to yell at me when I come back, if that makes sense, because yelling is a trigger for me. So it's like, what are the needs that are underlying the conflict? What do you need in this scenario? And being curious enough to be able to ask your partner, what do they need to support them to have this uncomfortable conversation?
Mm. Yeah, so communication is huge then. And I suppose it's communicating, like you said, about your needs. And yeah, like you said, if you start yelling, then this is a trigger for me. And I suppose, what do you suggest if you communicate your needs or you set a boundary and your partner doesn't then respect that boundary, they cross it again? What do you suggest for people in that situation where maybe they've been shut down by kind of communicating or trying to communicate what they need?
Yeah, it can be really hard when people aren't ready to hear this stuff, and kind of a lot of people will continue to shut that down and never really be interested in having those conversations, like no matter how hard you try. And I think you've got to that's where we need the two people on board in a way with this kind of thing. If it's only one person always trying to have these conversations and the other person never reciprocating, that's going to not necessarily resolve anything, because one person trying super hard is not going to help if the other person isn't willing to come to the party. Um, so what I would suggest in those kind of scenarios is, having that conversation with your partner. Okay, I've told you this already, and it didn't seem to really land. And then also communicating, what about that situation was hurtful to you, or how did that make you feel? Because if your partner knows, when I do this thing, it's really going to upset my partner, um, they're going to want to, if they're a loving partner, they're going to want to at least try and find a compromise or find a middle ground there. So they might want to go out with their boys, and that might be really distressing to you because you had a partner in the past who cheated on you or something, and you might say, it really stresses me out when you go out with the boys. And they're like, well, I'm still going to go, I still want to do that, but what can we do instead to find a middle ground where you feel safe in that and I feel like I can still go out without, triggering a wound for you? And it might be like a check-in every couple of hours or something, or a text message or something, like something as little as that. But without being able to really have that conversation, it's going to be hard. And you might come up against people who are just like, no, I'm doing it anyway, I don't care about what you're thinking and feeling. And that's the tricky part, where we have to question, okay, well, is this person right for me if they're so willing to just go out, wound me anyway. And they might have their own needs about going out, and that's okay. But it's like, it's the wounding part. It's like, are they willing to work with me so that we can
Mm-hmm.
find a middle ground? They don't have to give in entirely, because I don't think that's really fair either. But there's always some sort of compromise you can make if you're open to looking for it.
Mm,
Yeah.
amazing. And so I'd like to ask your opinion about boundaries, because I think that's, this podcast focuses a lot on feminine energy. And I think that's a big piece in relationship. A lot of women now are, reclaiming their divine feminine energy. And there's this misconception a lot of the time that the feminine is, passive and soft. And while that is somewhat true, it is more of the beta, the submissive and in a masculine feminine dynamic. Boundaries are really, really big for the feminine in order for her to fully flourish and be that soft, gentle, open space. There needs to be that strong boundary enforced. So I'm curious to hear your perspective on what advice you could give listeners who are wanting to maybe embody more of their feminine energy in the relationship, how they can set healthy boundaries in a feminine way, in more maybe a gentle or loving way.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of the time in our feminine energy, we just want to give so much. We just want to give to our partner and cook the dinner and do the things and be able to support our person, which is a beautiful intention, right? But sometimes there can be limits to that. And sometimes there can be points where, I don't know, you've come home and you're absolutely exhausted. And then there's an expectation that you're going to clean the whole house, or you're going to do whatever the giving that you normally do is. And I think that's the point where we need to have some boundaries, and we need to be able to say, this is impacting me in some way. And I need to be able to tell you when that's happening so that we can make another plan or something like that. And I think without boundaries, they have a quote: empathy without boundaries is self-destruction. Because when we're giving too much, but we don't know how to hold a boundary around that, we'll burn out. It's just as simple as
Mm,
that.
I
It
see
can
that
just
with a lot of women.
Yeah. Like, we've got the best of intentions, but
Mm,
it can often get just expected by the people around us when we're giving too much, and that it'll always be that way. And that's not necessarily the case. Like, we've got to have a limit around that. Otherwise, we will expend our energy and not be able to kind of keep that going long term. And so boundaries can be a really tricky one for a lot of women, and some men, because if we have a fear around, you know, what if I say no and someone reacts badly to that? What if they reject me? Like, I think we've very much entwined our giving and our helping and our loving someone with our value and our worth. And
mm,
you've really, that's a wound, right? And we've really got to extrapolate that to be able to say, I'm going to hold this boundary and I'm going to love myself regardless of how this other person responds to that boundary. Um, and that might be a wound from your childhood, because oftentimes, as the first daughter or whatever, there was an expectation that we would always help, and when we did help, we received love from our parents and our family. And if we didn't do what they wanted us to do, we would be shamed for it, right? So this can often play out in a relationship dynamic as well. But there's limits to how much we can give. So to be able to set a boundary, you have to be comfortable with the guilt that might come from that, which is guilt from being you trying to say no in the past and being shut down and said, no, you can't say no. You have to help the family. You have to do whatever, you know, which is, I think a lot of us kind of have a lot of those wounds.
I do definitely.
Yeah. So I kind of see boundaries as a bit of like um, a bit of a deal breaker. That's how I start when people don't know how to start a boundary or how to even like set a boundary. It's like, okay, I'm more than happy to say cook the dinner, but if I'm coming home from work late and you've been home for 4 hours, like, my boundary is, I would like you to help me and be able to help me out and do that in that way. And maybe the deal breaker is if you expect that from me every day of the week, regardless of circumstance. Like, if I'm working really late and it's 9 p.m. and you're still expecting me to cook the dinner when I get home, even though you've had all this time and the space to be able to do that. Um, that's something that I might have to question moving forward if this is the right relationship for me, because I want a supportive, loving, nurturing relationship. And I think it's really easy when we are in too much of our feminine energy to be kind of used in that way and have people push our boundaries in that way. And to be able to protect ourselves is to have boundaries. So I understand that a lot of people feel very uncomfortable setting a boundary and can be very challenging and guilt ridden for them to do that. But to remind yourself that you're looking after you when you do that, and you're going to be a better person. You're going to be a better wife and mother. You're going to be a better overall human, because you're going to get less triggered by things if you are able to set those boundaries when you need that time and space for yourself, and then come back and do it later when you don't, when you're fine, you're not exhausted, you're happy to cook the dinner. That's going to make you be able to do that for longer term. It's going to be more consistent. And it's also going to mean that when you do come home late from work and your partner hasn't cooked meals, you're not going to get resentful and lash out at them because they didn't help you when you feel like you needed the help. But you've never been able to say to them, hey, in these scenarios, I'm going to need this help. I'm going to need this help. I'm going to need this boundary here. Because sometimes our partners will miss things and won't get it. Like it might be implied, like, please help me when I'm like running home late from work. But these things unfortunately need to be spelled out very clearly. And that's where we can kind of run into trouble, I think. So yeah, boundaries is a skill. It's like a muscle you need to build. And I know for me, like the first time it was like, okay, I can say no once. And then once the person pushes, that's when I crumble and like, okay, I need to keep building this skill and this muscle and keep going. Like, is this something I want to do right now? Or is this something, my boss has come to me with another thing to add to the to-do list and I'm already really overworked and I'm already really stressed. Like, how can I say no in a way that's, polite and kind and, oh, thanks for thinking of me, but unfortunately I just can't manage that today, or that's going to have to be a priority for next week when I'm a bit more available. So you can say it in a polite, kind way, but still with firmness. And I think that's the important part, is like, we don't want to be screaming boundaries at people. Like, no, I don't want the extra workload. Like, and we don't have to be. We can say it in a polite, kind way and then go from there. Yeah.
I love everything you've just shared. It's been like a big journey for me personally. Like since I've started my feminine journey a few years ago, I was a massive people pleaser growing up, and I would always tend to attract men that were very dominant, very controlling, and it was pushing me to speak up and say no. And
Yeah.
so that's been really huge for me. And what I've found is just really interesting as I've been on this journey and learning to set boundaries. And it's just little things. And I always have that fear like, oh my God, what's going to happen if I say this? And what I've found is I've been surprised by the results of setting boundaries, because I've
Yeah.
found that when I have set a boundary, particularly with men, they've actually respected me more and treated me better from
Yes.
doing it, which is so surprising, because in my head, I think that they're going to, I don't know, maybe attack me or get
Mm.
angry at me. And it's been the opposite kind of response.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a really good benchmark for who were the people around me and how do these people treat me when you set a boundary, and seeing how they respond. So to someone who you say, sorry, unfortunately, I can't take on that extra thing at work right now, like I'm too busy or whatever, they're going to respond angrily and make you feel terribly. Like that's not a person you want to be, spending a lot of time with. Like that's someone who wants you for what you can do for them, right? But it's going to show you who your true friends are, because with your true friends, you're going to be like, I'm just so exhausted. I cannot come out tonight. And I'm sorry. I know you wanted to go out for your birthday, but I'm just like so exhausted. But let me take you out another time, like when I'm feeling a bit better. And that friend, you might be worried after you've sent that text, like, oh my God, are they going to come back and yell at me? That friend might come back and go, oh, no worries. Like, that's totally okay. Like, let's hang out when you're available and when you're ready. And it's just, it builds that sense of connection. It's like, oh, this is a safe person that I can be my whole self with. Like, if I can't give it all that night, that's okay. But I think it's the wound that programs us to think they're going to respond negatively.
Mm.
I had a person I don't want to say fuck buddy. What do I want to say? I was
Lover.
sleeping with intermittently, and I said I would go over to their house, and then I was feeling really unwell, and I was like, I don't want to go anymore. And I sent them this text like, I'm not going to come tonight. I'm feeling unwell. And the whole time I'm sitting there like shaking like a leaf, like, is he gonna hate me? All of this. And he just came back and like, totally fine, look after yourself. Like, that's all good. Like, chat later or whatever. And it was just, I just questioned, I'm like, where did this come from in me that I was expecting such a negative reaction for just putting my needs first and just saying, this is what I need right now. And that was a wound. And that was something I wanted to work on. But it also showed me that that person was a decent person and was willing to respect me when I wasn't available for them at that point.
Mm.
Yeah.
It's so true. And another thing that was just coming to me is like, it plays out with a lot of women, just even in our friendships, like you mentioned. It's like being afraid to bail at the last minute. Oh, we made plans to go out tonight. And then, oh, so I can see that showing up so much in my teen years, just thinking
Mm.
about it now.
Boundaries
Mm,
impacts all areas of our life. Like, you think, oh, this is related to relationships. No, it's related to everything. And people will treat you differently and treat you with more respect if you do set your boundaries with them.
mm, that's what I've been finding, definitely. But it's still hard to do. It's, I
Yeah,
know for me it is.
definitely.
Yeah, okay. And another thing I really love that you mentioned before was about communicating. You kind of mentioned about communicating directly. Like sometimes I think with women, it reminded me of, I don't know if you've studied John Gray's work, the guy who wrote Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus.
Oh,
I love him. And I read a lot of his books and I listen to a lot of his talks, and he speaks about how the male brain is wired differently to female brain, and the male brain typically needs direct
yeah,
communication. Like, I need you to cook me dinner at after this time. Like, it needs specific direction.
yeah.
Men that have more masculine energy tend to respond well with like direct communication, whereas
Mm,
women, the way our wiring is worked, our neurology is more around like subliminal messages, because women, we communicate by like, well, they should know what I mean, like, it's, isn't it obvious? And we tend to subliminally, I can't say that word, subliminally pick up on what other women are thinking just by, just by the energy even. And
mm,
we just assume, John Gray speaks about this a lot, that men do the same thing. And then we get really upset with our partners. Why doesn't he can tell I'm frustrated. But if we don't actually communicate it directly,
yeah.
they don't, it really doesn't register because of the different hormones and different neurology.
Yeah, yeah, most definitely. I think we're so good at reading people as women, and we're so good at picking up the
Mm.
emotions and like, oh, subtle shift in tone, therefore she's frustrated. Like, um, but yeah, people often will just miss that altogether if they're not on that wavelength, and if potentially masculine men. And sometimes we do have to be really clear and direct, and that's terrifying if you're not someone who likes setting boundaries, right? Like, it
Mm-hmm.
sounds like, oh my God, I have to
Yes.
lay it all out on the table. I can't just hint. You won't get the hints. Um, but no, it does have to be really laid out on the table for some people, because otherwise they're going to go, okay, maybe she's frustrated, but I don't understand why. Like, maybe she had a bad day at work, or maybe there's something else going on. I'm like, not even going to register, and there's often a lot underneath what we're actually frustrated about. Like, you might be frustrated your
Mm-hmm.
partner never takes the bins out, but
Mm-hmm.
underneath that is a wound around not feeling safe and supported, and not feeling like that they're helping out around the house, and that it's equal, and it's the same, like same level of shared responsibility. So there's a lot under that, even though it might just be, oh, never takes the bins out, and I tell him, like, it's disgusting that you never take the bins out, but maybe we need, instead of coming from a blame aspect, because again, people are going to tune that out very easily, like defensive, I'm freaking out because I'm being attacked, coming back at like, oh, babe, I'd really love it if you put the bins out like every Wednesday and I didn't have to remind you 5 times before you did it. Like, I think that would be really great for us. And that's going to build intimacy. That's going to build
Mm-hmm.
connection. It's a
Mm-hmm.
win-win for both parties. But when we're coming at it from a blame, aggressive way, you're just going to end up in conflict instead of kind of getting your needs met.
Mm. And appreciation as well. Like, if
Yeah.
you do communicate that taking the bins out is important to you, and then they do it, to make it a big deal and say thank you so much for listening to me. And even if you, I think some women can be like, oh, like, of course you should take the bins out. It's easy
Yeah.
to take that for granted, But I think it's really important, these little things, like you're saying, usually underneath them is like a really big wound,
Yeah.
and every like little trigger is an opportunity to strengthen the intimacy.
Yeah. And it's like you said before, like, why are we getting so triggered by our partners? Why are we flying off the
Mm,
handle about little things like taking the bins out? And it's because there's more to it underneath that. And because if we can't speak to that wound because it's too big, it's the little things that are going to speak to it. And it's a little bit of resentment here, there, and everywhere until it explodes because the bins still haven't been taken out. And it seems silly. And especially if we have that masculine partner who doesn't quite get the emotional cues, they're going to be like, why are you blowing up about this? Like, what's the big deal? But because it's escalated over time, you've missed three cues, you've missed three hints. Like, of course, I'm going to crack it at you. Like, so that's where it comes back to that communication piece of like, let's have the uncomfortable conversations. Let's be direct, even if it feels bad. Like, it feels ick to us, because that's going to get it across so much easier for our partner to understand and then be able to respond and actually help.
mm. And oh, there's so much, but okay. Where do I want to focus? I think we mentioned a bit about the masculine and feminine energy and the polarity between the two. I'd like to kind of dive into that a little bit. So, what are your thoughts on how important polarity is between masculine and feminine? And obviously, this doesn't have to do with gender; it could be any sex. It's just the energies that we're talking about. How important is that in a sacred union?
Yeah, it's so important. So this has only recently dawned on me myself in my own kind of relationships, that we can shift our polarity when we feel triggered or when we have trauma. And you see a lot of couples these days where the woman has that, I need to fix it, I need to help, I need to do all the things. And when their partner maybe isn't helping them out with that, or they feel like they're not getting their needs met in that way, they will just kind of go into this hyper independent response. And I feel like that's a very masculine way to look at it. So it's like these women are like, okay, he's not helping me with the bins, he's not helping me, you know, I don't know what, can't think of an example off the top of my head. Maybe like you want to buy a house and he's not helping you save for that.
Mm-hmm.
So because we've been so conditioned to fix it and to help and to people please and to not have boundaries, I think the original reaction to that is like, well, I don't want to yell at him because that's going to cause conflict. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it on myself to like work on my money mindset and work even harder and take longer shifts at work and do all the things, because then that way we'll be able to get to the goal. You know, I feel uncomfortable talking to him about it. It's too scary to have that conflict conversation. So I'm just going to do it instead. Like, and that comes from a big wound around no one was able to help you when you needed it. And therefore you just decided, I'll just do it all on my own. You see it a lot in those women who are like, I don't need a man. I'll just buy my own house by myself. Or they're in a relationship, like, I don't need him. I'll just do it myself. Um,
Mm,
yeah, I feel like a lot of women, when we've been let down, when we've been, had people who haven't been able to respond to our needs in the past, and we've just been shut down for our emotions, we just go into that masculine energy because it's our protector energy, right? Like, it looks after
mm.
us. So if no one else around you can look after you, you go into that
Yeah,
individualism.
you have to.
I'm going to protect myself. I'm going to make it work. And I totally understand and get that. But what we're doing when we do that and we go into that masculine energy is, one, we're attracting partners who are in their feminine energy and who aren't able to kind of step up and help us, or we're not attracting partners at all. I've been to a lot of workshops with women who've said, I can't work out why I can't attract someone to me who's the person I'm looking for. However, they're in this hyper independent energy
Mm,
space of like, I need to protect myself. I need to do all the things because no one else is. It's like an inability to receive help as well sometimes, like receive. We've never been able to receive from people around us. So we've just learned, I'm just going to shut myself off to receiving. And, it's safer when I do it my way than to let someone else try.
mm,
And that's where we can kind of run into trouble when we're taking on that masculine hat as well as women, because you end up managing the whole house. You're like doing the cleaning, but you're also doing the bills and you're the breadwinner maybe, and then you add a baby to that as well, and we're
mm,
be a mother, and it's just like there's so many things where I see this playing out in couples where their partner just isn't stepping up because of their own wounding, because they haven't been able to work on their own stuff. And it's not because they don't love their partner enough to help. Like, probably very kind and are happy that their partner's doing all the things, but there's just no capacity to be able to step into that masculine energy for themselves. Because what you find is, whether you're a man or a woman, usually what attracts is that masculine feminine energy. So even in same-sex couples, you'll see one of them is like the provider, the breadwinner, and maybe the other one's more of the homemaker, and that's the balance.
Mm.
So when we're too far into one and not enough into other, because we both have masculine and feminine energies inside all of us,
Mm.
we're able, usually we do flip between two, but when we are in that trauma response of like, no one's helping me, I need to protect myself, you're going to stay more in that masculine energy because that's what you've learned is protective for you. And you're going to continue having these kind of interactions with people where people aren't quite able to help you meet your needs at all. Um, and that can be really dissatisfying in a relationship. That can be really hard. That can build a lot of resentment because it's like, I can't do it all. I can't be the mum and the provider and this and that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I need some help. You're my teammate. You're my partner. You should be stepping up. But we're stuck in these energies, and that's kind of holding us back a little bit. So both, again, everything's a dynamic. Both parties need to look at, okay, am I jumping in too quickly to fix and to solve? And am I not even allowing my partner to give it a go because, he can't clean as good as I can or whatever it is?
Mm-hmm.
And for the other side of that dynamic, like, where can I help her more? Where can I be that support? Where can I step into my masculine and hold the feminine so she's able to have her emotions and cry it out? And I'm just going to hold her in that safe container until she's like let it all out, and then we can kind of come back around. That's the way it should work. But unfortunately, we find ourselves just jumping into this as a kind of fix it solution mode. Um, but we're avoiding the emotions in that. So there's a lot of anxious energy around it's not working out, it's not happening. I'm just going to jump into fix it mode and do it myself. But you've avoided that feeling of anxiety around like, what if it doesn't work out, or what if it doesn't go right, or what if it isn't the right timing? What if divine timing is pushing us out for another 6 months or whatever it is? You've jumped into that masculine energy, and this can be really difficult for people in relationships because you can get stuck in this role going forward. And
Mm.
if one of you shifts, you almost need the other one to shift as well. Otherwise, it's not necessarily going to work. Like, you can step out of your masculine into your feminine, but then if your feminine partner isn't willing to step up into their masculine energy, like, no one's going to be the breadwinner. No one's going to be bringing money into that home. So it
Mm.
kind of needs to be a balance as well. So to start with that, if you're realizing like, oh, maybe this is me, maybe this is my partnership, like, we love each other, that's very obvious, but there's this aspect of like not feeling safe and supported. There's something going on there. I think it's like you said, it's like about balancing your own inner masculine and feminine energies first, because if you
Mm-hmm.
can bring those into alignment where it's like, oh, I finally feel safe enough to step back into that feminine and be held and supported, and to receive the love and to receive the nurturing and the support, in the financial aspect and whatever other aspect. But I can step into my masculine maybe when I'm at work and I need to get
Mm.
things done and we're on a deadline and whatever. You're going to be able to attract someone who also has that worked out within themselves in your next partnership. So your next partner might be someone who is able to be that support for you, but also be the breadwinner or be the financial support as well. So it all starts from within with working on ourselves and our wounds. And I recently went through this where I've been in my masculine energy for like 15 years since
Mm.
that first trauma that I had in relationships, because that was my protector and that's how I looked after myself. And that was learning all the red flags. That was, just cutting people off if it's not working, and that's not necessarily helpful. But I finally was like, oh, this isn't working for me. I want to be a wife and mother, but I want to be fully supported in that. I want a partner who's a teammate. I want all of that, and I don't want to have it all on my back and feel like it's all on me, otherwise it's not getting done. Like, that's a big burden to carry.
Mm-hmm. I think a
um
lot of women carry that. I saw that definitely with my parents' relationship.
yeah, yeah, I think it's a lot more common than we'd think it is.
Mm.
um and that's why I want to start just talking about it and discussing it and how we can shift that, because it needs to be into the consciousness and the awareness so we can bring more balanced, healed relationships into existence, because that's just going to help everyone around that scenario.
Mm.
So by stepping into my feminine, I realized that there was a lot of wounds that came up, a lot of wounds around not being supported, a lot of wounds around me being too emotional and needing that to be shut down. And it was interesting. The people around me was just responding differently to me than what they would when I was in my, direct and firm masculine energy. And that was really difficult for me as well, because it was like, okay, I want to be in this feminine energy space, but I also didn't realize that there was a bunch of wounds that happened to me when I was in that space that I'd kind of shut off when I decided to close my heart to that. And now they're coming up again 15 years later, the exact same wound. It's really weird. But I guess this is the journey. It keeps happening. Like there's always more shadows to be worked through. Um, but yeah, now that I feel like I've really stepped into that and worked through those wounds and allowed myself to feel safe in the feminine. And I find that people around me are also changing and stepping up as well in their ability to support me and to look after me. And I'm receiving the help a lot differently than I used to, and being more open to that. And by bringing that back into balance, I'm feeling a lot happier and a lot more set up for when I do eventually become a mother, to children and stuff like that, that hopefully I can show them that it's, it's safe to be in that energy where, you're looked after by a man or by someone, and that it's okay to rely on someone, and it's okay to feel emotions, and it's okay to, have a moment where you're very emotionally expressive, maybe not directed at anyone, but just in general, and then coming back down to calm and to nurturing yourself and to being like, what do I need today? Is it to go out? No, it's just to be at home and look after myself. I'm going to give that to me. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah, I see it a lot with the work that I do and running women's circles, and so many women. It's just growing more and more since I've began really running events. I've seen it just really just ramp up over the past couple of years. Women saying, I'm tired of just being the one who has to have everything together, and it's like I think women are coming back to wanting to be taken care of. And I know that kind of goes against the whole like feminist narrative that we need to be strong, boss babes, independent woman. I don't need a man. But I think there's something beautiful about wanting a relationship. And I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to be taken care of. It's actually it's a natural quality of our feminine energy. The masculine energy is independence, but the feminine energy is dependence, right? And it's not in a needy codependent way. It's just that it's nice to receive. We don't have to actually be the ones to give and to do everything all the time. It's nice to just, yeah, of course you can do it, but wouldn't it be nice for someone to do it for you?
Yeah.
For you to be treated like a queen or a goddess or a princess, it's like, yeah, of course you can open your door, but wouldn't it be nice for someone to open it for you
Yeah.
because they value you so much? And I think that's the beautiful dynamic about the masculine and the feminine. And, when you see a man in his healthy masculine, it feels good for him to do that for the feminine. Like he wants to do that,
Yeah. Yeah.
because there's a natural respect for the womb that he's come from, right?
Yeah.
And for women to just receive that and be like, wow, like I don't actually have to do anything to receive that respect or to have that someone to value me that much. Like just the fact that I'm, this beautiful divine feminine being, my being just means that I'm innately worthy of that.
Yes, yes. And the more the feminine is supported, the more you can be supported to be the best version of yourself. Like if
Mm.
you are supported by your partner really well, you're going to be able to support your children even better than if you were doing everything around the house and feeling like it was all on you. If you're working in survival mode when everything's all on you, we deserve to be in that safe container where we can go, does it feel safe today for me to do all this extra stuff? Is this something I'm willing to do today, clean the entire house, or is it not? Like, why does it have to be prescribed? And I see it kind of as levels, honestly. It's like we've been hurt by the masculine. So we've decided to put this shield over our heart and go, I don't need anyone. And, I can do it all myself. And like, there's a time and a place for that. And especially if you've come from a place of like not having very healthy relationships and people really hurting you, like, can be really good to step away from that and go, I've got my own back and like and work on that within yourself. But then the next level of that is like, can you open your heart again to be able to let in that really divine masculine energy who wants to be there for you, who wants to support you, who wants to give you the princess treatment. But and we're going to receive that because we deserve it, but we're also going to do it in a way that we're not going to use that and overtake from the masculine. We're going to just
Mm.
grateful for that and use that to even share more of our heart with the world. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I love it. Okay. So, my final question for you, and this is something I ask all my guests on the podcast, is because you're on the Thank Goddess podcast, this podcast is about awakening goddess consciousness within ourselves and the planet at large. And goddess consciousness to me means leading from your heart, being in your authenticity, being in your divine feminine energy. And so, when do you feel most aligned with the goddess?
Ooh. Um, I feel most aligned with the goddess when I'm just being my true self and I'm not worried about who people need me to be. And I don't have to have that protection mechanism up of like, oh, I can't talk about this because it's going to upset them, or, they're going to be unhappy with me, or they're not going to like me. It's really just being authentic to myself and going, okay, do I need to set a boundary right now? My heart is saying yes. I don't want to do this extra task at work or whatever it is. Um, so I'm going to trust myself and back myself enough that that person around me will love me enough to accept that. And if they don't, that's okay because I love myself enough to move on with my life if they don't.
Mm, thank you. And where can people find you if they're wanting to connect with you further and maybe purchase your book?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram under Kiara Jade Official. Yeah, and I've got workshops I do on boundaries and things like that. And my book on conflict is out, and I'm writing another book on relationship dynamics.
Wow.
I'd absolutely love to see you there and to support anyone who needs it.
Mm, amazing. And I'll include all your links in the show notes. Thank you once again, Kiara, for being here. This has been so amazing. I've loved talking to you, and I could talk to you for another hour or hours too, but we'll leave it here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dani. That's been amazing.